Let me tell you about the day the Galactic Council finally decided to check out humanity's military capabilities. You know, like a cosmic version of, hey, let's see what the new kid on the block is packing. Spoiler alert, they probably should have minded their own business. The whole thing started because Ambassador Vkr'lak of the Altarian Empire, picture a 7-foot praying mantis with delusions of grandeur and a voice that sounds like gravel in a blender, had been running his mouth at the monthly Galactic Council meetings. Again, these humans, he'd been saying, waving his razor-sharp appendages around like he was conducting an orchestra of doom. They claim to have warships. Warships! Have you seen their planet? Half of it is covered in water they can't even drink, and the other half is populated by creatures that actively try to kill each other for sport. How sophisticated could their military technology possibly be? This from a species whose idea of advanced weaponry was strapping lasers to the backs of domesticated space whales. But sure, Vkr'lak, tell us more about sophistication. The thing is, humanity had only joined the Galactic Council 18 months prior, and frankly, most species were still trying to figure out what to make of us. We were this weird anomaly, technologically advanced enough to achieve faster-than-light travel, but apparently insane enough to do things like voluntarily jump out of perfectly good aircraft for fun, or eat plants that literally burn our mouths because we enjoy the sensation. Captain Daniel Tank Kowalski was humanity's military liaison to the Council, which was either a stroke of genius or the worst possible choice, depending on your perspective. Tank, and yes, everyone called him Tank, including his commanding officers, was the kind of guy who once arm-wrestled a Krelian war chief into submission and then bought the guy a beer afterward. He stood 6'4", had shoulders that could serve as landing pads for small aircraft, and possessed the sort of easygoing confidence that came from knowing he could probably bench press most alien delegates. The funny thing about Tank was that despite looking like he could snap a telephone pole in half, he had a doctorate in xenopsychology and spoke 17 languages fluently. Humans, as it turned out, were complicated like that. So when Vkr'lak stood up in the council chambers that Tuesday morning, his triangular head swiveling around to address the assembled delegates, Tank just leaned back in his chair and smiled. It wasn't a particularly nice smile. "I propose," Vkr'lak announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension that made everyone in the room want to punch him, "that we conduct an official inspection of humanity's so-called fleet, for the security of the galaxy, of course. We need to ensure these newcomers aren't making claims they cannot substantiate." The chamber erupted in the alien equivalent of murmurs, which sounded like a combination of whale songs, clicking sounds, and what might have been a garbage disposal having an existential crisis. Some delegates nodded their various head analogues in agreement. Others looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. Tank stood up slowly, which had the immediate effect of making everyone in his general vicinity take a step back. When you're built like a linebacker and have the kind of reputation that precedes you across 3-star systems, people tend to give you space. "Well," he said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber without him having to raise it, "if the council wants to see what we've got, we'd be happy to give you the grand tour. Fair warning, though, we take our security pretty seriously. Hope that's not a problem." The way he said it, all casual and friendly, somehow managed to sound like both an invitation and a threat, which, knowing Tank, it probably was. Vkr'lak's mandibles twitched in what passed for a smile among his species. "I'm sure we can handle whatever primitive defenses you've cobbled together, Captain." And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the moment when Tank's grin got really interesting. The kind of grin that suggested someone was about to learn something they really didn't want to know. Chapter 2. The Invitation Extended, or Famous Last Words, Galactic Edition. You know what they say about assumptions making an ass out of you and me? Well, in galactic politics, assumptions tend to make an ass out of entire civilizations, and sometimes those civilizations have really big guns pointed at you afterward. The formal inspection was scheduled for the following week, which gave the human delegation just enough time to select the perfect ship for the tour. And by perfect, I mean the one most likely to give the Galactic Council representatives nightmares for the next few decades. The meeting to choose said vessel took place in what humans had designated as Conference Room Alpha aboard Starbase Olympus, humanity's primary military installation in the Centauri system. The room itself was unremarkable. Standard-issue furniture, coffee-stained table, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were dying of some horrible disease. Present were Tank, Admiral Rebecca Ice Queen Frost, whose nickname was either a reference to her unflappable demeanor under pressure, or her tendency to make grown admirals cry during briefings, and Commander Blake Wrench Patterson, Chief Engineer of the Third Fleet. "So," Admiral Frost began, consulting the holographic display floating above the table, "our distinguished guests want to see what we're capable of. Suggestions? Wrench leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. The man was built like a bear, and had the kind of hands that suggested he'd spent most of his life either fixing engines or breaking things that weren't engines. We could show them the defiance. She's pretty, conventional, won't scare anybody too badly. Tank shook his head. Vkr'lak specifically called our tech primitive. If we show them something conventional, he's just going to assume we're proving his point. Fair enough, Frost said. What about the retribution? She's got enough firepower to glass a small moon. Too aggressive, Tank replied. We want to make a statement, not start a war. Yet. The three of them sat in contemplative silence for a moment. The kind of silence that usually preceded either brilliant ideas or spectacularly bad decisions. In this case, it was Wrench who broke it. What about the persistence? Both Tank and Frost turned to stare at him. The persistence was, well, calling it unconventional was like calling a nuclear explosion a bit warm. The experimental ship? Frost asked slowly. The one that technically doesn't exist in any official capacity? That's the one, Wrench said, grinning. She's armed, she's weird as hell, and she's definitely not what they're expecting. Tank's eyes lit up. Oh, that's evil. I like it. Admiral Frost looked between the two of them like a parent trying to decide whether to ground her children or join them in whatever mischief they were planning. The persistence is classified at levels that require retinal scans just to acknowledge she exists. Perfect, Tank said. Nothing says don't underestimate us like giving someone a peek behind the curtain. A very, very small peek, Wrench added. We don't have to show them everything. Just enough to make them think twice about calling us primitive. Frost was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table. Finally, she sighed. Against my better judgment, I'm approving this. But gentlemen, if this goes sideways, and we end up in a shooting war because you two decided to show off, I'm personally spacing both of you. Tank saluted with mock seriousness. Understood, Admiral. We'll try to keep the traumatizing to a minimum. Try harder, she replied dryly. Chapter 3. Preparations. Or, How to Polish a Secret Weapon. The Persistence hung in space dock like a metallic middle finger extended toward the cosmos, which was probably appropriate considering her origins. She didn't look like much, just another heavy cruiser from the outside, maybe a bit more angular than usual, with hull plating that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But appearances, as any good engineer will tell you, can be deceiving. The ship had been commissioned 2 years earlier as part of Project Blackwater, humanity's response to the growing realization that the galaxy was a dangerous place full of beings who might not have humanity's best interests at heart. While the official military was building conventional vessels, bigger guns, thicker armor, faster engines, a small group of engineers and scientists had been asking a different question entirely. What if we stopped trying to fight fair? Commander Rachel Vasquez had been asking herself that same question for the better part of 6 months, as she oversaw the final modifications to the Persistence. She was a compact woman, with the kind of intense focus that came from spending most of her career making impossible things work properly. And right now, she was focused on making sure their distinguished guests got exactly the tour they deserved. "Wrench, how long until the delegation arrives?" she called out, not looking up from the diagnostic readout she was studying. 4 hours, came the reply from somewhere beneath the main console. A series of sparks erupted from the opening, followed by some creative cursing in 3 languages. And before you ask, yes, everything will be ready. Probably. Probably isn't good enough, Tank's voice echoed through the bridge as he emerged from the lift. We need this to work perfectly. 1 shot to make an impression. Vasquez finally looked up from her readout. Define impression. The kind where they go home and tell their friends not to mess with humanity, Tank replied, settling into the captain's chair. The kind where Ambassador Vkr'lak stops making jokes about primitive humans and starts sleeping with one eye open. Both eyes, Wrench corrected, emerging from beneath the console with his hair standing at odd angles and what looked like engine coolant staining his uniform. Mantises don't have eyelids. Tank considered this. Then I guess he'll just have to learn to sleep standing up. Can you do that thing where the ship looks bigger from the inside? Vasquez and Wrench exchanged glances. The thing Tank was referring to was one of the Persistence's more unusual features. A spatial displacement field generator that could make the ship's interior dimensions larger than its exterior ones. It was the kind of technology that broke several fundamental laws of physics and made theoretical physicists cry. We can, Vasquez said carefully, but it's going to be obvious something's weird the moment they step aboard. Good, Tank replied. Obvious is what we're going for. I want them confused, impressed, and just a little bit terrified. In that order. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Rivera chose that moment to arrive on the bridge, carrying what appeared to be a standard military tablet and the expression of someone who'd been reading reports that weren't supposed to exist. Rivera served as the ship's intelligence officer, which was a polite way of saying he was the guy who knew where all the bodies were buried and how deep. "Captain," he said, offering a quick salute. "Final guest list is confirmed. We've got Vkr'lak, obviously, plus representatives from the Vkr'lak Collective, the Sonorian Trade Federation, and the Galactic Defense Corps. 12 beings total, representing 6 species." Tank nodded. "Any particular concerns?" "The Vkr'lak representative is Admiral Kestar," Rivera replied. "She's got a reputation for being thorough. If there's something to notice, she'll notice it." "What about the others?" "Standard diplomatic types, mostly. The Sonorian is actually an engineer, which could be interesting. And the GDC representative is General Torvin, the one who commanded the siege of Kepler Station." Tank whistled softly. Torvin was famous throughout Council space for being one of the finest military minds of his generation, and infamous for his ability to spot weaknesses in enemy formations from halfway across a solar system. If they were going to impress anyone today, it would be him. "All right, people," Tank said, pushing himself up from the chair. "We've got 4 hours to make sure this ship is ready to blow some minds. Let's make it count." Chapter 4. The Arrival. Or, When Assumptions Meet Reality. The transport shuttle diplomatic courtesy was exactly as boring as its name suggested. A utilitarian box with engines, designed to move dignitaries from point A to point B without anyone getting shot, poisoned, or accidentally sucked out an airlock, which, in galactic politics, counted as a rousing success. Ambassador Vkr'lak occupied the forward compartment, his elongated frame folded into what passed for a comfortable position among his species. His compound eyes surveyed the approaching human starbase with the sort of casual disdain usually reserved for particularly unimpressive insects, which, considering his species' evolutionary history, was probably appropriate. "Remind me," he said to his aide, a smaller Altarian who went by the name of Skrit, "why we're wasting our time with this inspection." Skrit consulted his datapad, antenna twitching nervously. "The humans claim to have advanced military capabilities during the council session. You challenged them to prove it." "Ah, yes," Vkr'lak replied, his mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement. "I remember now. Well, I suppose even primitive savages deserve the chance to embarrass themselves properly." From the middle compartment came a sound that could charitably be described as throat-clearing, if throats were made of gravel and disappointment. Admiral Kestar of the Vkr'lak Collective was not known for her patience with diplomatic niceties, and she was already running low on both patience and niceties. "Perhaps," she said in her species' characteristic gravelly tone, "we should reserve judgment until we actually see what they have to show us." The Vkr'lak were a practical people, 6 feet of muscle, bone, and bad attitude wrapped in what looked like natural armor plating. They'd been fighting wars since before most species had discovered fire, and they had very little patience for beings who talked more than they fought. "Of course, Admiral," Vkr'lak replied, though his tone suggested he considered this about as likely as finding a competent politician. "I'm sure the humans will provide us with adequate entertainment." In the rear compartment, General Torvin of the Galactic Defense Corps was studying tactical readouts on his personal display, his forearms moving in the precise, economical gestures of someone who'd spent decades commanding fleets in actual combat. The Zaltharians were a curious species, tall, thin, with an extra set of arms and the kind of analytical mindset that made them natural strategists. "General," his aide inquired softly, "your assessment?" Torvin was quiet for a moment, considering. "The humans have achieved faster-than-light capability, and successfully established a foothold in Council space within a remarkably short time frame. Either they're exceptionally capable, or they're exceptionally lucky. I'm curious to determine which." The shuttle's pilot, a bored-looking Sonorian whose purple skin suggested he'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy, announced their approach to the human vessel over the comm system. "ETA to docking, 10 minutes. Please secure any loose items and prepare for standard docking procedures." Through the viewports, Starbase Olympus grew larger, a sprawling complex of docking arms, defensive platforms, and what appeared to be enough firepower to reduce a small fleet to constituent atoms. It was impressive in the way that all military installations were impressive. Lots of guns, serious-looking people, and the general sense that someone, somewhere, was ready to ruin your entire day. But it was the ship moored at Docking Arm 7 that caught everyone's attention. The Persistence hung in space like a predator at rest, her dark hull absorbing the starlight rather than reflecting it. She was larger than the standard Council cruiser design, but somehow gave the impression of being even bigger than she actually was. Her lines were clean and efficient, with none of the ornate decoration favored by some species. This was a ship built for purpose, not show. General Torvin murmured, studying the vessel through his viewport. Interesting design, very utilitarian. It looks like a cargo hauler, Vkr'lak observed dismissively. Are we certain this is a warship? Admiral Kestar was studying the ship more carefully, her experienced eye noting details that the others missed. The way the hull plating seemed to flow together seamlessly, the unusual configuration of what appeared to be sensor arrays. The complete absence of obvious weapon emplacements. There's more to this than meets the eye, she said quietly. 20 minutes later, they were about to discover exactly how much more. Chapter 5. Welcome aboard. Or, reality starts getting flexible. The docking tube connected to the Persistence with the sort of mechanical precision that suggested someone had been practicing, and the delegation made their way through the standard airlock protocols with the weary efficiency of beings who spent too much of their lives traveling between ships. Tank was waiting for them in what appeared to be a perfectly normal airlock antechamber, wearing his dress uniform and the kind of smile that could mean either welcome aboard or abandon hope, all ye who enter here. With Tank, it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference. Ambassador Vkr'lak, Admiral Kestar, General Torvin, he said, offering a human-style salute that somehow managed to be both respectful and slightly mocking. Welcome aboard the Persistence. I'm Captain Kowalski, your host for today's tour. Vkr'lak's compound eyes swiveled to take in the chamber, clearly cataloging every detail. Standard human construction, unremarkable materials, nothing particularly impressive. He was already preparing his dismissive comments when Tank gestured toward the interior door. Shall we? The moment they stepped through that door, several fundamental assumptions about reality took a quick vacation. The corridor they entered was wrong. Not wrong in any obvious way. The lighting was standard, the walls were properly aligned, the deck plating was regulation military gray. But the corridor was clearly longer than the ship they'd observed from outside. Significantly longer. General Torvin stopped walking entirely, his four arms moving to different instruments as he began taking measurements. Admiral Kestar's scarred features creased into a frown as she studied the impossible architecture. Even Vkr'lak's mandibles stopped their constant clicking. Interesting design choice, Vkr'lak said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Very spacious. Tank's grin widened slightly. We like to make sure our crew has room to work. Follow me. The bridge is this way. They walked for what felt like several minutes, passing junction points, side corridors, and maintenance alcoves that absolutely could not fit inside the ship they'd seen from outside. None of the delegates said anything, but the silence had weight to it, the kind of silence that preceded either violence or very uncomfortable questions. The bridge, when they finally reached it, was a study in controlled chaos. Banks of displays showed tactical information, engineering readouts, and what appeared to be real-time monitoring data for systems that shouldn't exist. The command chair was occupied by Commander Vasquez, who looked up from her displays with the sort of expression that suggested she was solving several impossible problems simultaneously and enjoying every minute of it. Commander, Tank said, our guests would like to know more about our capabilities. Perhaps you could give them the technical overview. Vasquez stood, offering a quick nod to the delegation. Certainly, Captain. Ladies and gentlemen, you're standing on the bridge of an experimental vessel incorporating several advanced technologies. Our primary innovation is the spatial displacement field generator, which allows us to maximize interior volume relative to our exterior footprint. She said it like she was discussing the weather, as if casually violating the laws of physics was something humans did every Tuesday. General Torvin finally found his voice. That's not possible. The energy requirements alone would exceed the output of a small star. You'd think so, wouldn't you? Vasquez replied cheerfully. We thought the same thing until we figured out how to tap directly into quantum vacuum fluctuations. Turns out reality has a lot more flexibility than most people realize. Admiral Kestar was studying the tactical displays, her experienced eye picking out details that made her increasingly uncomfortable. These sensor readings, she said slowly. They're showing weapon systems I don't recognize. Tank and Vasquez exchanged glances. Would you like to see the armory? Tank asked. The question was phrased like an invitation, but somehow sounded like a challenge. And despite every instinct telling them that this was probably a very bad idea, every single member of the delegation found themselves nodding. After all, they'd come here to see what humanity was capable of. They were about to get their wish. Chapter 6. The Armory. Or, when unconventional warfare becomes an art form. The armory was accessed through what Tank casually referred to as the express elevator. which turned out to be another impossible feature of an increasingly impossible ship. The elevator car traveled for what felt like several minutes straight down, passing deck indicators that suggested they were descending well below what should have been the ship's keel. "How deep does this ship go?" Admiral Kestar asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Deep enough," Tank replied, which wasn't really an answer but somehow felt like one. When the elevator finally stopped and the doors opened, the delegation stepped into a space that redefined their understanding of the word armory. The chamber stretched away in both directions further than they could see, lined with weapon systems that ranged from recognizable to utterly alien. Commander Rivera was waiting for them, tablet in hand and the expression of someone who was about to enjoy himself immensely. "Welcome to Armory 7, he said. "One of 15 aboard the Persistence. We've prepared a small demonstration of our capabilities." Zethkri's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. Even his natural arrogance was having trouble processing what he was seeing. "These weapons," he said slowly. "I don't recognize most of these designs." "That's because we don't build weapons the same way most species do," Rivera replied. "Most military thinking focuses on bigger guns, stronger armor, faster ships. We prefer to think differently." He gestured to the nearest weapons rack, which held what appeared to be a collection of completely ordinary-looking devices. "For example, this looks like a standard plasma rifle, correct?" General Torvin nodded, his forearms already reaching for his instruments. "Standard military configuration, nothing unusual." "Watch this," Rivera said, lifting the weapon and pointing it at a target downrange. The weapon fired, producing a perfectly normal plasma bolt that struck the target with exactly the expected result. A hole burned clean through the center. "Now," Rivera continued, adjusting something on the weapon's side. "Watch this." He fired again. This time the plasma bolt struck the target and kept going. Through the target, through the backstop, and according to the readouts on the range's monitors, through the next 3 bulkheads before finally dissipating. "Quantum tunneling plasma," Rivera explained casually. "Ignores most conventional armor entirely. Matter is mostly empty space anyway. We just convinced the plasma to remember that." The delegation stared at him like he'd just announced he could juggle neutron stars. "But that's—" General Torvin started, then stopped, his tactical mind already racing through the implications. "The armor on most Council ships wouldn't even slow that down." "No," Rivera agreed cheerfully. "It wouldn't. Shall we continue?" The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in creative application of physical laws. Rivera showed them gravity bombs that could crush a starship into a marble-sized ball of ultra-dense matter. Temporal mines that could slow local time to a crawl, leaving enemy vessels frozen in space while the rest of the universe moved around them. Energy weapons that fired backwards through time to hit targets before they were actually fired. With each demonstration, the delegation grew quieter. Even Zethkri had stopped making dismissive comments. "Of course," Rivera said as they reached the end of the weapons display. "These are just our conventional systems. The really interesting stuff is classified." Admiral Kestar finally found her voice. "What you've shown us today, this represents a complete revolution in warfare. How long have you been developing these technologies?" Tank and Rivera exchanged glances. "About 18 months, Tank replied. "Give or take." The silence that followed could have been used to preserve food. 18 months, General Torvin repeated slowly. "You've developed weapons technology that makes our finest military hardware obsolete. In 18 months? Well," Tank said, "we had motivation. Turns out the galaxy is a dangerous place, and we figured we should probably be ready for whatever we might run into. Speaking of which, would you like to see the defensive systems?" At this point, several members of the delegation looked like they might prefer to just go home and pretend this conversation had never happened. But they'd come too far to stop now. Besides, how much worse could it get? Chapter 7, Defense in Depth, or Why Attacking Humans Might Be Bad for Your Health. The defensive systems tour began in what Tank referred to as the Situation Room, a circular chamber dominated by a holographic display that showed the Persistence surrounded by what appeared to be absolutely nothing. Which, as they were about to learn, was exactly the point. Commander Vasquez was back, this time accompanied by a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Samara Kim, the ship's chief science officer. Dr. Kim had the sort of intense, slightly manic energy that suggested she spent most of her time thinking about problems that would give normal people nightmares. "The thing about defense, Dr. Kim began, gesturing to the holographic display, "is that most species think about it in terms of armor and shields. Bigger plates, stronger fields, more energy. It's very linear thinking." She manipulated the display, and suddenly the empty space around the Persistence was filled with indicators showing fields, barriers, and defensive systems that had been completely invisible moments before. "We prefer a more comprehensive approach," she continued. General Torvin was studying the display intently, his forearms working his instruments. "I'm not detecting any of these systems." "That's because they're not technically there," Dr. Kim replied. "Phase-shifted defensive grids exist in parallel dimensions, only shifting into our reality when needed. Quantum uncertainty barriers make it impossible for incoming projectiles to maintain a fixed position. They literally don't know where they are, so they can't hit us. And temporal displacement fields slow incoming attacks to a crawl while accelerating our response time." She said it like she was discussing lunch plans. Ambassador Vkr'lak had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the tour, his natural arrogance warring with the mounting evidence that humanity was significantly more dangerous than he'd assumed. "These technologies," he said finally, "they must require enormous resources to develop and deploy. Surely you can't have many ships equipped with such systems." Tank's smile took on that particular quality that suggested someone was about to receive very bad news. "Actually, Admiral Frost wanted me to mention that we're currently in production on our second-generation defensive systems. This ship represents our first-generation technology." The implications of that statement hit the delegation like a physical blow. "Second generation?" Admiral Kessatar asked quietly. "Well," Dr. Kim said, "we learned a lot building the Persistence. The new ships are improved." General Torvin had gone very still, his tactical mind racing through the implications. "How many ships are you planning to build?" Tank exchanged glances with his officers. "The current construction schedule calls for 100 vessels in the first wave, with production ramping up from there. We're aiming for full fleet deployment within 5 years." The delegation absorbed this information in stunned silence. 100 ships, each equipped with weapons and defenses that made their own fleets obsolete. And this was just the beginning. "Of course," Tank continued conversationally. "That's assuming we don't run into any serious threats that require us to accelerate the timeline. We can be very motivated when properly encouraged." The way he said it made it clear that encouragement was not something anyone wanted to provide. Commander Rivera chose that moment to approach with a datapad and the expression of someone delivering a status report. "Captain, we're receiving a priority communication from Starbase Olympus. Admiral Frost wants to know if our guests would be interested in observing today's weapons test." Tank's eyebrows rose slightly. "We're conducting a weapons test today?" "Apparently so, sir. The test range has been cleared, and all appropriate safety protocols are in place." The delegation exchanged glances. They'd already seen demonstrations of individual weapons systems, but a full-scale test would give them a better idea of the ship's overall capabilities. And despite their growing unease, they were all military professionals with a job to do. "Very well," General Torvin said finally. "We would be interested to observe." Tank nodded. "Excellent. Fair warning, though, we're testing some of our newer systems today. It might get a little dramatic." And with that ominous pronouncement, they headed for the observation deck to watch humanity demonstrate exactly why picking a fight with them might not be the best idea in the galaxy. Chapter 8. Field Test. Or, When Humans Get Creative with High Explosives. The observation deck of the Persistence offered a panoramic view of the test range, a carefully designated area of space roughly the size of a small solar system, cleared of all traffic and marked with enough warning beacons to light up a small city. Floating in the center of this range were the test targets, decommissioned ships from various Council species, donated for the purpose of weapons testing and arranged in formations that simulated real combat scenarios. Tank had provided comfortable seating for the delegation, along with refreshments and what he described as basic sensory protection equipment. The equipment turned out to be military-grade eyewear and audio dampeners, which should have been the first clue that they were about to witness something spectacular. "The test targets represent a standard Council battle group," Commander Vasquez announced from her position at the tactical station. 3 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 2 support vessels, arranged in defensive formation Charlie 7. Range to target, approximately 50,000 kilometers. Admiral Kestar was studying the targets through the observation windows, her experienced eye noting the positioning and defensive capabilities. "That's a substantial force. In any normal engagement, it would require a fleet to challenge effectively." "You'd think so," Tank replied, settling into his chair with the casual confidence of someone about to demonstrate why assumptions could be dangerous. "Dr. Kim, if you would be so kind." Dr. Kim nodded and began entering commands into her console. "Initiating test sequence Alpha 7. All hands, stand by for weapons deployment." The first thing the delegation noticed was that nothing visible happened. No weapon ports opened, no missile tubes extended, no obvious preparations for combat. The Persistence simply hung in space, looking exactly as she had moments before. "Quantum torpedo deployment in progress," Dr. Kim announced. "Target acquisition confirmed, firing sequence initiated." And then reality got interesting. The quantum torpedoes were invisible to conventional sensors, existing in a state of quantum superposition until the moment they struck their targets. The first indication that anything had happened was when one of the heavy cruisers simply wasn't there anymore. Not destroyed, not damaged, just gone, as if it had never existed in the first place. "What?" Vkr'lak started, then stopped as a second cruiser vanished. "Quantum torpedoes work by convincing matter that it would rather exist elsewhere," Dr. Kim explained conversationally. "Very clean, very efficient, no messy debris to clean up afterward." The third cruiser lasted approximately 3 seconds longer before it too ceased to exist. General Torvin was frantically working his instruments, trying to get readings on what had just happened. "My sensors show no weapons fire, no energy discharge, no physical projectiles. How is this possible?" "Trade secret," Tank replied cheerfully. "Shall we continue with the demonstration?" The destroyers lasted slightly longer, primarily because Dr. Kim decided to use them to test the temporal displacement weapons. The delegation watched in fascination and growing horror as the smaller ships began moving in slow motion, their hulls aging centuries and seconds as localized time fields accelerated entropy around them. "Temporal warfare," Rivera observed, making notes on his tablet. "Makes conventional shielding irrelevant since we're not actually attacking the ship. We're attacking time itself around the ship." One of the destroyers finally crumbled into dust, its hull simply unable to withstand the passage of accelerated time. The others followed shortly after. "And for our final demonstration," Dr. Kim announced, "we'll be testing our newest addition to the arsenal, the reality revision torpedo." Even Tank looked slightly nervous at this pronouncement. "Are we sure that's ready for field testing?" "Only one way to find out," Dr. Kim replied, her grin taking on a slightly manic quality. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" The answer to that question turned out to be quite a lot, actually. The reality revision torpedo worked by temporarily rewriting local physical laws within a small area of space. In theory, this would allow for effects that were impossible under normal circumstances. In practice, it meant that the 2 remaining support vessels suddenly found themselves in a region of space where gravity flowed upward. Electromagnetic radiation moved in spirals, and the speed of light was more of a polite suggestion than an absolute constant. The ships held together for approximately 10 seconds before their own internal systems, no longer operating under familiar physics, tore them apart from the inside. "Huh," Dr. Kim said, studying her readouts. "Better than last time. We only accidentally created 2 pocket dimensions and a small temporal paradox." The observation deck had gone completely silent except for the soft humming of life support systems and what might have been General Torvin muttering prayers in his native language. Finally, Ambassador Vkr'lak found his voice. You just eliminated an entire battle group in under 5 minutes, without taking any damage, without even appearing to fire any weapons." "Well," Tank said, "we did fire weapons. They were just really hard to see, or detect, or comprehend, apparently." Admiral Kestar was staring out at the empty space where 11 warships had been floating just minutes before. "Captain Kowalski," she said slowly, "what you've just demonstrated represents a complete paradigm shift in military capability. These weapons, they don't just destroy enemy forces. They remove them from existence entirely." "Pretty much," Tank agreed. "Though to be fair, the reality revision torpedo is still experimental. Sometimes instead of destroying the target, it just relocates it to a parallel universe. We're working on consistency issues." The casual way he said it, as if accidentally banishing enemy fleets to alternate dimensions was merely a minor technical inconvenience, somehow made it even more terrifying. General Torvin had finally managed to collect himself enough to speak coherently. "Captain, I need to ask, what would it take to convince humanity not to use these weapons?" Tank considered the question seriously. "Well, General, that depends. We're pretty reasonable people, generally speaking. We don't go looking for fights, and we're happy to coexist peacefully with our neighbors. But if someone decides to threaten Earth or human colonies or human civilians," he shrugged, "then we might have to get creative." "Creative," Vkr'lak repeated faintly. "Very creative," Dr. Kim added helpfully. "We've got some ideas we haven't tested yet. There's this one concept involving weaponized entropy that could theoretically age an entire star system to death, but we're still working out the targeting algorithms." The delegation absorbed this information in the kind of silence usually associated with funeral parlors and tax audits. Chapter 9. The tour continues. Or, when things go from bad to worse. After witnessing the complete annihilation of a simulated battle group, the delegation might have been forgiven for assuming they'd seen the worst of what humanity had to offer. This assumption lasted approximately 15 minutes, which was when Tank announced they'd be visiting the engineering section. "I really think you'll find this interesting," he said as they made their way through corridors that continued to be longer than they should have been. "Commander Patterson has been working on some fascinating projects." They found Wrench in what could charitably be described as organized chaos, a massive engineering bay filled with half-assembled devices, holographic blueprints, and the sort of warning signs that suggested approaching too closely might result in spontaneous combustion, temporal displacement, or transformation into exotic matter. "Ah, perfect timing," Wrench called out, looking up from what appeared to be a small star contained in a magnetic bottle. "I was just testing the new power distribution system." Admiral Kestar approached cautiously, her combat-trained instincts screaming that the glowing object was extremely dangerous. Is that an actual star?" "Miniaturized," Wrench replied cheerfully. "About the size of a basketball, but it's got roughly the same energy output as our original home star. We use it to power the ship's more exotic systems." General Torvin's forearms were moving frantically as he tried to process what he was seeing. "You're using a star as a battery?" "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds sort of primitive," Wrench said. "But yeah, essentially. The quantum displacement systems require a lot of power, and conventional fusion reactors just weren't cutting it. So we figured, why not use the real thing?" He said it like he was discussing replacing a flashlight battery. "Doctor!" Kim had wandered over to another workstation, where she was examining what looked like a collection of geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. "Oh, Wrench, you got the hyperdimensional storage units working." "Finally," Wrench replied. Turns out the trick was convincing them that three-dimensional space was more of a suggestion than a requirement. Now we can store about 17 times our normal cargo capacity in the same physical space. Vkr'lak was staring at the geometric shapes with growing alarm. Those aren't possible. They appear to exist in more dimensions than space actually has." "Space is more flexible than most people think," Dr. Kim replied absently, poking at one of the shapes with what appeared to be a multidimensional probe. "Once you stop thinking of physical laws as limitations and start thinking of them as guidelines, all sorts of interesting possibilities open up." The tour of engineering continued for another hour, during which the delegation was introduced to concepts that would have made their top scientists weep with frustration. Faster-than-light communication systems that worked by sending messages backwards through time. Matter replicators that worked by convincing atoms they wanted to be different atoms. And what Wrench casually referred to as the backup engine, which appeared to be powered by controlled black holes. "Black holes," General Torvin said weakly. "You're using black holes as engines." "Microscopic ones," Wrench clarified. "Very safe, very efficient. Although we did lose one ship during testing when the containment field failed and the engine decided to become a full-sized black hole. Took out most of the test range, but we learned a lot." By this point, the delegation had moved well beyond shock and into the territory of existential crisis. They'd come aboard expecting to see primitive human technology, maybe get a few laughs at humanity's expense. Instead, they'd discovered that humans had somehow managed to turn physics into a suggestion and engineering into an art form. "Captain," Admiral Kestar said finally, "I have to ask, why? Why develop all of this? What are you preparing for?" Tank's expression grew serious for the first time since the tour began. "Admiral, when we first achieved faster-than-light travel and started exploring the galaxy, we discovered something that concerned us. The galaxy is full of civilizations that have been around for thousands of years, with established territories, ancient grudges, and very large fleets. Humanity was the new kid on the block, and we had no idea who we could trust." He gestured around the engineering bay, where impossible technologies hummed quietly in the background. "So we decided to make sure that if anyone decided to test us, they'd regret it. We didn't want to conquer anyone, and we didn't want to rule anyone. We just wanted to make sure that attacking humanity would be the last mistake anyone ever made." The delegation digested this in uncomfortable silence. Finally, General Torvin spoke up. "Captain, what you've shown us today, it changes everything. The balance of power in the galaxy, the nature of warfare itself, the fundamental assumptions that underlie interstellar relations. This technology could destabilize everything." Tank nodded thoughtfully. "It could. Or it could provide the kind of deterrent that ensures nobody feels the need to start any wars in the first place. Mutual assured destruction on a galactic scale. And if someone doesn't get the message?" Tank's smile returned, colder than before. "Then we'll provide a more pointed demonstration." Chapter 10. The Final Revelation, or When Humans Show Their True Colors. The tour was winding down, and the delegation was beginning to think they might actually survive the experience with their sanity mostly intact. This optimism lasted until Tank announced they had one final stop to make. "I've saved the best for last," he said, leading them to what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary door marked with a simple sign. Strategic Planning Department. The room beyond the door was normal. Disappointingly, reassuringly normal. Standard conference table, comfortable chairs, wall displays showing tactical information. After hours of impossible technology and physics-defying demonstrations, the mundane nature of the space was almost jarring. Seated at the conference table was a woman who introduced herself as Director Morgan Hayes, Strategic Analysis Division. She was unremarkable in the way that truly dangerous people often were. Average height, average build, the sort of person you wouldn't notice in a crowd until she started explaining exactly how she was going to destroy your entire civilization. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to the chairs around the table. "I thought it might be useful to discuss the broader strategic implications of what you've seen today." The delegation took their seats warily. After everything they'd experienced, a normal conversation about strategy seemed almost too good to be true. Director Hayes activated the wall displays, showing star maps of the local galactic region. "Gentlemen, ladies, what you've seen aboard the Persistence represents approximately 18 months of focused development. Our second-generation vessels are already in advanced testing, and our third-generation designs are moving from theoretical to practical." She touched a control, and the star maps zoomed out, showing the entire galaxy. "But here's what I really want you to understand. Everything you've seen today, the weapons, the defenses, the impossible technologies, they're not our primary strategic asset." General Torvin leaned forward. "Torvin, what do you mean?" Director Hayes smiled, and for the first time since boarding the ship, the delegation realized they might not have been seeing the full picture. "Our primary strategic asset," she said quietly, "is that we think differently. Every species in the galaxy has spent thousands of years developing along predictable lines. Bigger weapons, stronger defenses, faster ships, linear progression, logical development." She gestured to the displays, which now showed comparative technology trees for various galactic civilizations. "Humans don't think that way. We don't see rules as limitations, we see them as problems to be solved. We don't accept that something is impossible just because no one has done it before. And most importantly, we don't fight fair." The room had gone very quiet. "Take this ship, for example," Hayes continued. "The spatial displacement technology that makes our interiors larger than our exteriors. We developed that because we were annoyed that ship design was limited by hull volume. The quantum weapons that remove targets from existence. We built those because we were tired of dealing with debris fields after battles." She touched another control, and the displays showed human colony worlds scattered throughout Council space. "Every single one of our colonies is defended by technologies your civilizations haven't dreamed of. Every human ship carries weapons that could eliminate entire fleets. And every human citizen understands that our survival depends on making sure the galaxy knows not to test us." Ambassador Zethkri had been growing increasingly agitated throughout this explanation. "Are you threatening us?" Hayes looked genuinely surprised. "Threatening? No, Ambassador, I'm educating you." "There's a difference." She stood up and walked to the star map, pointing to various systems. "The Altarian Empire controls 43 star systems and has a fleet of approximately 800 vessels. The Vkr'lak Collective spans 31 systems with 600 ships. The Galactic Defense Corps protects over 200 worlds with the largest fleet in known space, nearly 3,000 vessels." She turned back to face the delegation. "Humanity currently operates 17 colonies in 12 star systems, with a fleet of exactly 12 vessels. By any conventional measure, we shouldn't be a threat to anyone." General Torvin was beginning to see where this was going. "But conventional measures don't apply to you." "Exactly," Hayes replied. "Those 12 ships could eliminate every fleet in Council space in a matter of days. Our colonies are protected by defenses that would make your best fortress worlds look like cardboard boxes. And we've barely gotten started." She returned to her chair, her expression serious. "Here's what I want you to take away from today's demonstration. Humanity doesn't want to rule the galaxy. We don't want to conquer anyone's territory or subjugate anyone's people. We just want to be left alone to live our lives and explore the universe." The delegation waited for the but. "But," Hayes continued, "if anyone decides to threaten human civilians, attack human colonies, or otherwise make the mistake of viewing us as easy targets, they will discover that humanity has a very creative approach to problem solving." She touched the controls again, and the displays now showed detailed schematics for weapons systems that made everything they'd seen earlier look like children's toys. "These are our 4th-generation designs. Still theoretical, but we expect to have prototypes within the year. Planet killers that work by convincing matter that it would prefer to be energy. Stellar manipulation weapons that can cause stars to go nova on command. and what our engineers are calling the reset button, a device that can theoretically return a target star system to the state it was in several million years ago. The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, Admiral Kestar found her voice. Director Hayes, what you're describing, it's not warfare, it's godlike power. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Yes, I suppose it is. And we're very responsible gods, generally speaking. We believe in live and let live, peaceful coexistence, all those nice diplomatic concepts. Her expression hardened slightly. But gods can be wrathful when provoked, and humanity has a very long memory. Chapter 11. Diplomatic Conclusions, or How to End a Conversation Without Starting a War. The return journey to the docking bay was conducted in complete silence, broken only by the soft hum of the ship's systems and what might have been General Torvin muttering calculations under his breath. The delegation had clearly moved beyond shock into the territory of strategic recalculation, which was exactly what Tank had been hoping for. As they reached the airlock, Director Hayes joined them for the final farewell. She carried a small package wrapped in what appeared to be standard diplomatic packaging. A small gift for the Council, she said, offering the package to Ambassador Vkr'lak. Technical specifications for some of our first-generation defensive technologies. Nothing too advanced, just enough to help upgrade your existing fleets to something approaching modern standards. Vkr'lak accepted the package with the sort of care usually reserved for handling live explosives, which, given what they'd seen today, it very well might contain. This is generous, he said carefully. Hayes smiled. Humanity believes in helping our neighbors. After all, a strong galaxy is a stable galaxy, and stability is good for everyone. Tank stepped forward as the delegation prepared to board their shuttle. I hope today's tour has been educational. General Torvin was the first to respond. Educational doesn't begin to cover it, Captain. You've fundamentally altered my understanding of what's possible in military technology. And in the process, Admiral Kestar added, you've made it clear that attacking humanity would be... She paused, searching for the right words. Inadvisable, Tank suggested helpfully. That's one way to put it, she replied. Ambassador Vkr'lak had been unusually quiet during the final exchanges, his compound eyes studying Tank with what might have been newfound respect, or possibly fear. With Altarians, it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference. Captain, he said finally, when I challenged humanity's military capabilities in the council chambers, I was operating under certain assumptions. Assumptions can be dangerous, Tank replied neutrally. Indeed, I believe I owe your species an apology, and perhaps a public acknowledgement that those assumptions were incorrect. Tank's smile was genuinely warm for the first time all day. Ambassador, I think that would go a long way toward improving interspecies relations. The delegation boarded their shuttle in contemplative silence, each lost in thoughts about the implications of what they'd witnessed. As the shuttle departed from the Persistence, Tank and his officers watched from the observation deck. Think we got the message across? Commander Vasquez asked. Tank nodded, still watching the shuttle disappear into the distance. Oh, I think they understand. The question is what they'll do with that understanding. Director Hayes joined them at the window. According to our intelligence reports, Ambassador Vkr'lak has already sent 3 priority communications to the Altarian High Command. General Torvin has requested an immediate meeting with the GDC Strategic Planning Board, and Admiral Kestar has placed her entire fleet on defensive alert. Sounds about right, Tank said. What about the others? The Sonorian engineer has submitted a formal request for a technology exchange program, Hayes replied. And the diplomatic corps representatives are all composing reports that essentially boil down to don't mess with the humans. Rivera looked up from his tablet. Captain, we're receiving a communication from Admiral Frost. She wants to know if we traumatize them appropriately. Tank grinned. Tell the Admiral that I believe our guests have gained a new appreciation for humanity's commitment to peaceful coexistence. And if they didn't get the message? Tank's grin took on that familiar edge. Then next time we'll have to be more direct. Chapter 12. Aftermath and Implications, or When Word Gets Around. The Galactic Council emergency session was called for 3 days after the delegation's return, which was either a new record for bureaucratic efficiency or a sign that someone was genuinely concerned about the implications of what they'd learned. The chamber was packed, with representatives from every major civilization in council space, plus a few minor ones who'd heard rumors and wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Ambassador Vkr'lak stood at the central podium, looking distinctly uncomfortable. For a being whose species had evolved from predatory insects, discomfort was not a natural state. and it showed in the way his mandibles twitched and his compound eyes refused to focus on any one point for more than a few seconds. "Esteemed colleagues," he began, his voice carrying none of its usual arrogance, "I have asked for this emergency session to address certain discoveries made during our recent inspection of human military capabilities." The chamber erupted in the multilingual equivalent of murmurs, clicks, chirps, growls, and sounds that might have been applause or might have been someone strangling a small animal. Council sessions were never quiet, but this was louder than usual. "The short version," Vkr'lak continued once the noise died down, "is that humanity possesses military technologies that render most of our existing strategic assumptions obsolete." More noise from the chamber, this time with a distinctly alarmed tone. General Torvin rose from his seat in the military section. "If I may, Ambassador, I believe a more detailed briefing would be appropriate. The implications of what we witnessed extend far beyond simple military capability." For the next 2 hours, the delegation provided the Council with a comprehensive overview of their visit to the Persistence. They covered the spatial displacement technology, the quantum weapons, the reality-altering defensive systems, and the casual way humans discussed concepts that violated fundamental physical laws. By the time they finished, the chamber had gone completely silent. The kind of silence usually associated with funeral services for people you didn't particularly like but were obligated to mourn anyway. Chancellor Vkr'lak of the Hegemony, an ancient being whose species had been playing galactic politics since before most civilizations had discovered agriculture, finally broke the silence. "Let me ensure I understand this correctly," he said in his characteristic whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the chamber. "The humans have developed weapons that can eliminate targets from existence entirely, defensive systems that operate in parallel dimensions, and power sources that involve miniaturized stars and controlled black holes." "That's correct, Chancellor," General Torvin confirmed. "And they accomplished this in approximately 18 months. Also correct. And they indicated that these represent their first-generation technologies." "Yes, sir." Chancellor Vkr'lak was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes studying something only he could see. Finally, he spoke again. "I have lived for over 800 years. I have seen the rise and fall of dozens of civilizations. I have witnessed wars that consumed entire star systems and peace negotiations that reshaped the galaxy. And in all that time, I have never encountered anything quite like this." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The humans have, in less than 2 years, developed the capability to single-handedly alter the balance of power in the galaxy. They could, if they chose, eliminate any civilization that opposed them. They could restructure interstellar politics according to their whims. They could become the dominant force in known space." Another pause, longer this time. "And instead, they chose to invite us aboard their ship and politely explain why attacking them would be a bad idea." The implications of this statement rippled through the chamber like a physical wave. "This suggests," the Chancellor continued, "that humanity is either supremely confident in their abilities or genuinely committed to peaceful coexistence, possibly both." Ambassador Kethmar of the Sonorian Trade Federation, a practical being whose species had built their civilization on commerce and mutual benefit, raised a tentacle to request recognition. "Chancellor, if I may. The humans also provided us with technical specifications for some of their defensive technologies. Not their most advanced systems, but enough to significantly improve our existing capabilities." This caused another stir in the chamber. Sharing military technology was unusual in galactic politics, generally only done between close allies or under extreme duress. "They're giving away military technology?" asked Representative Zerkesh of the Outer Colonies. "According to Director Hayes, they believe that a well-defended galaxy is a stable galaxy," Admiral Kessitar replied. "Apparently, they prefer their neighbors to be strong enough to defend themselves rather than requiring human intervention." Chancellor Vkr'lak nodded slowly. "Fascinating. Most species that achieve overwhelming military superiority tend to use it as a tool for expansion or control. The humans seem to be using it as a tool for what? Insurance? Deterrence, General Torvin suggested. They've made it clear that while they have no intention of starting conflicts, they're perfectly prepared to end them." The debate continued for several more hours, but the conclusion was never really in doubt. A formal resolution was passed, acknowledging humanity as a strategic partner in galactic security, and recommending that all Council species exercise appropriate diplomatic consideration in their interactions with human representatives. In other words, be very, very nice to the humans, because annoying them would be bad for your health and the health of everyone you'd ever met. Epilogue. New Equilibrium. Or, How the galaxy learned to stop worrying and love the humans. 6 months later, the Persistence was docked at Starbase Olympus for routine maintenance and upgrades, which in human terms meant, let's see what impossible thing we can bolt on next. Tank was in his quarters, reviewing reports from various human colonies and trying to decide whether the Vkr'lakian request for a technology exchange was genuine diplomacy or an elaborate intelligence-gathering operation. Commander Vasquez knocked on his doorframe, carrying what appeared to be a bottle of something that was probably alcoholic and definitely not regulation. "Captain, thought you might want to see this," she said, offering him a datapad. "Latest intelligence reports from across Council space." Tank accepted the pad and the bottle, in that order. The reports made for interesting reading. The Altarian Empire had formally disbanded 3 of their battle fleets, citing changing strategic requirements. The Vkr'lakian collective had redirected their military budget toward defensive systems and diplomatic initiatives. The Galactic Defense Corps had quietly shelved their expansion plans and started focusing on peacekeeping operations instead of fleet modernization. "Looks like our little demonstration had the desired effect," Tank observed. "More than desired," Vasquez replied. "Intelligence estimates that the chance of large-scale military conflict in our region has dropped by approximately 70%. Nobody wants to be the one who finds out what our second-generation ships can do." Tank opened the bottle and poured 2 glasses of whatever Vasquez had acquired. "Any word on the Sonorian Technology Exchange?" "Approved by their Trade Council yesterday. They're sending a delegation next month to discuss joint research projects. Apparently they're particularly interested in our power generation technologies." "And the others?" "The outer colonies want to discuss mutual defense agreements. The hegemony is interested in cultural exchange programs. Even the isolationist Cretan Dominion has sent formal diplomatic overtures." Tank raised his glass in a mock toast. "To the power of overwhelming technological superiority and the wisdom to use it responsibly." Vasquez clinked her glass against his. "And to the look on Zethkri's face when he realized we weren't bluffing." They drank, enjoying the momentary peace and quiet. Outside the viewports, construction crews were working on the next generation of human vessels, ships that would make the Persistence look primitive by comparison. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today the galaxy was peaceful, humanity was secure, and nobody was shooting at anyone else. It was, Tank reflected, a pretty good day. His communicator chimed with an incoming message from Admiral Frost. He read it quickly, then started laughing. "What?" Vasquez asked. Tank handed her the communicator. "The Council just voted to establish a new position, Galactic Peacekeeping Coordinator. They want to know if humanity would be interested in the job." Vasquez read the message, then started laughing too. "They want us to be the galaxy's hall monitors?" "Looks that way. The pay is excellent. The benefits include diplomatic immunity throughout Council space, and the job description essentially boils down to make sure everyone plays nice." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the stars and contemplating the strange turns life could take. A year ago, humanity had been the new kids on the galactic block, scrambling to establish themselves among civilizations that had been around for millennia. Now they were being asked to serve as the galaxy's peacekeepers, armed with weapons that could rewrite the laws of physics and the wisdom to use them sparingly. "So," Vasquez asked finally, "are we going to take the job?" Tank finished his drink and stood up, looking out at the stars that humanity was slowly making their own. "You know what? I think we are. After all, someone has to keep an eye on things. And if someone steps out of line," Tank's smile was pure predator, "then we'll remind them why that's not a good idea." Outside, the construction crews continued their work, building ships that would ensure humanity's place in the galaxy for generations to come. And across Council space, various civilizations were learning to live with the knowledge that their new neighbors were very friendly, very reasonable, and very, very dangerous. It was, all things considered, probably the best possible outcome for everyone involved. The end. So here's the thing about humans. And trust me, I'm about to tell you a story that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the food chain. We're supposedly the galaxy's newest adorable species. Yeah, adorable. Like a particularly aggressive hamster, according to the Galactic Council's initial assessment. Small, furry, well, some of us. Prone to running on wheels, metaphorically speaking, though given our obsession with treadmills, maybe not so metaphorical. And absolutely harmless. The Council had it all figured out, see? They'd done their research. Watched our nature documentaries. Apparently someone leaked Planet Earth to the galactic equivalent of Netflix about 50 years before first contact. Drew all the wrong conclusions. "Oh, look," they probably said, clicking their various appendages in what passes for laughter among beings with too many joints. "The little humans are so concerned about their cute polar bears and pandas. They must be the softest species in the galaxy." Enter Lieutenant Commander David Sterling, whose entire career was about to become a masterclass in why you should never judge a species by its wildlife preservation efforts. David was what you might generously call average human specimen number 47, if you were filling out a really boring government form. Brown hair that did whatever it wanted despite his best efforts with various hair products. Brown eyes that had seen too much paperwork, and the kind of build that suggested he did push-ups sometimes but also really enjoyed pizza. In other words, he looked like every third guy you'd see at a Starbucks on a Tuesday morning. He also happened to be humanity's first official representative to the Galactic Military Academy on Kepler Station. No pressure or anything. "This is either going to be the best assignment of my career or the shortest," David muttered to himself as the transport shuttle approached the massive station. Through the viewport, Kepler Station looked like someone had taken a city and rolled it into a ball, then stuck it in space and covered it with more blinking lights than a Christmas tree factory explosion. The station was home to approximately 2.3 million beings from over 400 different species, all training to become the galaxy's finest military officers. It was also, according to the orientation packet David had been studying for the past 6 months, home to at least 40 different ways he could die just by breathing wrong. Apparently, human oxygen requirements were considered charmingly specific by galactic standards. The shuttle docked with a gentle thunk that somehow managed to sound expensive. David grabbed his regulation duffel bag, the same one he'd been using since basic training because apparently some things never change, and prepared to meet his destiny, or at least his roommate. Chapter 2. Roommate Roulette, Galactic Edition. The first thing David learned about Kepler Station was that whoever designed the living quarters had apparently never met a human before. "Are you sure this is for 2 occupants?" he asked the automated check-in terminal, which responded with a cheerful holographic display of his room assignment. The room was exactly 7 feet by 12 feet, which would have been fine for storage, but was apparently meant to house him and something called a Vkr'lak battleborn. Now, David wasn't xenophobic. You couldn't be, really, when you were representing your entire species. But he'd done his homework on the Vkr'laks, and the words battleborn didn't exactly scream great at sharing bathroom schedules. The Vkr'laks were what happened when evolution looked at a grizzly bear, decided it wasn't nearly scary enough, and added opposable thumbs, tactical intelligence, and a cultural obsession with personal combat. They stood about 8 feet tall on average, weighed in somewhere around 400 pounds of muscle and attitude, and their idea of a handshake could allegedly crush steel. They were also, according to the cultural briefings David had memorized, the galaxy's premier warriors. Their homeworld was basically Australia, if Australia had been designed by someone with serious anger management issues and a grudge against anything that couldn't kill you 17 different ways. So naturally, the Academy's housing algorithm had decided David would be perfect roommates with one. "This is fine," David said to nobody in particular. "I'm sure we'll get along great. Maybe we'll braid each other's hair and talk about our feelings." He found room 847C after only 3 wrong turns and 1 embarrassing incident involving what he thought was an elevator, but turned out to be a garbage compactor. The door was standard issue, reinforced titanium steel composite that could withstand a direct hit from a plasma rifle, according to the helpful plaque next to it. David pressed his palm to the scanner, and the door slid open to reveal what looked like the aftermath of a very specific natural disaster. His roommate was there, all right. Corinth, and David only knew his name because it was helpfully stenciled on a trunk that looked like it had been used as a chew toy by something with very large teeth, was exactly what Central Casting would have ordered if they'd needed someone to play terrifying alien warrior number 4. He stood a solid 8.5 feet tall, covered in what looked like natural armor plating, with arms that could have been borrowed from a small crane. His head was vaguely bear-like, if bears had evolved specifically to give children nightmares, and his hands ended in claws that were definitely not just for show. Currently, he was reorganizing the furniture by the simple method of picking up David's Regulation Academy-issued desk and moving it to the other side of the room one-handed. Their eyes met. David had been in the military long enough to recognize a dominance display when he saw one. This was the moment where he was supposed to either establish his position in the pecking order or resign himself to getting stuffed in lockers for the next 4 years. He set down his duffel bag, walked over to his displaced desk, and moved it back where it had been. Corinth's eyes narrowed. He picked up the desk again and moved it back. David moved it again. They stared at each other for a long moment. David could practically see the gears turning in Corinth's head. probably calculating exactly how many pieces he could tear a human into and whether it would be worth the paperwork. Then David did something that probably saved his life, though he wouldn't realize it until much later. He grinned. "You know," he said conversationally, "where I come from, we have a saying. This room ain't big enough for the both of us. But looking at this place, I'm thinking it's not big enough for either of us." Corinth tilted his massive head, which David chose to interpret as confusion rather than the prelude to violence. "I'm David," he continued, sticking out his hand. "I'm guessing you're Corinth, unless someone else has been using your trunk as a scratching post." For a moment, David thought he might have just volunteered for impromptu surgery via claw. Then Corinth made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could level buildings. "You are either very brave or very stupid, small human," Corinth said in a voice like an avalanche with a speech impediment. "Why not both?" David replied. "I've found they often go together." And that, believe it or not, was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Chapter 3. Enter the Apex Predator. David's first encounter with what the Academy's rumor mill called the Apex Predator came during his 3rd week at the Academy, right around the time he'd started to think he might actually survive his education. He was in the library. Because yes, even space military academies had libraries, though this one looked more like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of information, when he heard what sounded like someone having a very bad day in several different languages simultaneously. The commotion was coming from the xenobiology section, where a small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an argument between a student and one of the research assistants. The student was human, the first other human David had seen since arriving at the Academy. She was maybe 5'6", with the kind of compact build that suggested she spent serious time in the gym. Auburn hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and green eyes that were currently fixed on her opponent with the kind of intensity that made David think of laser targeting systems. Her opponent was something David's pattern recognition software immediately classified as "do not engage without backup and possibly artillery." The being stood nearly 9 feet tall, with the kind of predatory grace that suggested its ancestors had spent millions of years perfecting the art of turning other creatures into lunch. Its skin looked like it had been carved from black obsidian. Its limbs were too long and ended in claws that could probably open a can of soup or disembowel you with equal efficiency. And its head was distinctly reptilian, with the kind of teeth that made David's dental insurance premiums seem inadequate. This was a Kethmori huntmaster, one of the galaxy's most feared species. They were apex predators on a world where everything else was also an apex predator, which had led to an evolutionary arms race that had produced beings so dangerous that most civilizations considered them carefully and then found reasons to be somewhere else. They were also, according to David's briefings, incapable of backing down from any challenge, real or perceived. And the small human woman was apparently lecturing it about proper citation formats. "Completely unacceptable," she was saying in the kind of tone that David recognized from his high school English teacher. "You can't just reference ancient knowledge and call it a day. If you're going to cite cultural practices, you need to provide specific sources, dates, and cultural contexts." The huntmaster's response was a sound like a freight train having an argument with a construction site. David didn't speak Kethmori, but body language was fairly universal, and this particular conversation was heading toward the kind of conclusion that usually required medical attention for everyone in a 50-foot radius. "I am Vkr'lak the Undefeated," the creature snarled in accented but clear Standard Galactic. "I have claimed 73 victories in personal combat. I do not require lessons in academic protocols from a small, soft creature whose species has not yet learned to hunt properly." The crowd around them had gone very quiet. This was the kind of moment where sensible people found reasons to be somewhere else, preferably somewhere with thick walls and excellent defensive positions. The human woman, her nameplate said, Cadet Rivera, looked up at 9 feet of weaponized nightmare and did something that made David's military training start screaming warnings about situational awareness and tactical disadvantage. She smiled. 73 victories, she said thoughtfully. "That's impressive. I bet you're very proud of them." Vkr'lak's head tilted slightly, which David suspected meant confusion rather than the prelude to violence, though with huntmasters it was often hard to tell the difference. "I am," he said carefully. "Good," Cadet Rivera continued in the same pleasant tone. "Now sit down, shut up, and fix your bibliography." What happened next would become the stuff of Academy legend. Vkr'lak the Undefeated, huntmaster of the Kethmori, apex predator whose species had never developed the concept of retreat, looked down at the small human who had just given him what amounted to a direct order, and sat down. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that comes right before reality takes a moment to recalibrate. "Better," Rivera said, as if having a 9-foot killing machine obey her commands was the most natural thing in the world. Now, let's talk about proper academic formatting. David stood there, along with about 20 other beings, watching a human woman who couldn't have weighed more than 130 pounds give study tips to something that could have bench-pressed a small vehicle. And the really crazy part? Vkr'lak was taking notes. Chapter 4. The Science of Impossible Things. David spent the next hour watching what could only be described as the galaxy's most improbable tutoring session. Cadet Rivera, whose first name, he learned from her study materials, was Elena, had apparently appointed herself as Vkr'lak's personal academic advisor. She was going through his research paper line by line, pointing out formatting errors, citation problems, and what she called lazy argumentation. Vkr'lak, for his part, was listening with the kind of intense focus that his species usually reserved for tracking prey. "See, this is what I'm talking about," Elena said, highlighting a section of text on her tablet. "You write, 'It is known among my people that,' but you don't explain how it's known, who determined it, or when this knowledge was established. It's not academic writing, it's just assertion." "But it is ancient knowledge," Vkr'lak protested, his voice carrying the kind of patient tone that suggested he was working very hard not to eat anyone. "Passed down through generations of huntmasters." "That's great," Elena replied, "but this isn't a cultural studies class. This is xenobiology. If you want to reference cultural practices, you need to cite anthropological sources, not just say, 'My grandfather told me.'" David found himself edging closer to the conversation, partly out of professional curiosity, and partly because he was watching something that challenged his understanding of how the universe was supposed to work. "The thing is," Elena continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was casually reformatting the worldview of one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators, "your core argument is actually really solid. You just need to present it properly." Vkr'lak's head tilted again. "You believe my research has merit? Of course it does. The integration of cultural hunting practices with biological adaptation patterns? That's fascinating stuff. You're just presenting it like you're writing a personal journal instead of an academic paper." David watched Vkr'lak's posture change subtly. The predatory tension that had been radiating from him like heat from a forge was gradually being replaced by something that looked almost like interest? "Engagement? You would assist me in improving this work?" Vkr'lak asked. Elena looked up from her tablet and smiled. Not the sharp, challenging smile from earlier, but something warmer and more genuine. "Sure, but we're going to do this properly. Full citations, peer review, the whole 9 yards. I do not understand the reference to yards. It's a human expression. It means we're going to do it right." And that was when David realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history: the domestication of an apex predator through aggressive tutoring. Chapter 5. The reputation spreads. Word of the library incident spread through the Academy's informal communication networks at roughly the speed of scandal, which is to say, faster than light and with considerable creative embellishment. By the end of the week, David had heard at least 6 different versions of the story. In some versions, Elena had challenged Vkr'lak to single combat and won through superior intellect. In others, she'd used some kind of human psychological warfare technique. In the most creative version, she'd apparently hypnotized him using advanced Earth-based mind control methods. The truth, David discovered over the following weeks, was simultaneously more mundane and more remarkable than any of the rumors. Elena Rivera was a graduate student in comparative xenobiology, who had somehow ended up at the Galactic Military Academy through what she described as a series of administrative errors and poor life choices. She was 26 years old, held degrees in both biology and anthropology, and had apparently spent the last 3 years studying predator-prey relationships across different species. She was also, David learned, completely fearless in the way that only people who had never properly considered the consequences of their actions could be. "The thing about apex predators," she explained to David over lunch one day, while Vkr'lak sat nearby working on his revised research paper, "is that they're not actually used to being challenged intellectually. They're used to being feared, respected, obeyed. They're not used to being taught." David looked over at Vkr'lak, who was currently using claws that could shred steel to carefully annotate his bibliography. "And that works because underneath all that evolutionary weaponry, they're still intelligent beings. They still want to understand things, to learn, to grow. They just need someone to show them how to do it in a structured way. But why do they listen to you?" Elena considered this while stabbing her salad with the kind of precision that suggested she'd given this question considerable thought. "I think," she said finally, "it's because I don't treat them like they're dangerous. I treat them like they're students. David had to admit this seemed to be working. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd watched Elena gradually accumulate what could only be described as a collection of apex predators who had apparently decided she was their academic advisor. There was HFY, of course, but also Gorthk, a Saurian combat specialist who had started attending Elena's informal study groups after she'd helped him with a tactical analysis paper. Then there was Jithara, a crystalline being from a warrior culture that communicated through harmonic frequencies and had somehow ended up in Elena's xenobiology discussion group. Most recently, she'd acquired Thorn, a void walker whose species was known for their ability to survive in hard vacuum and their tendency to challenge anything that looked at them funny. Thorn had approached Elena after she'd publicly critiqued his presentation on environmental adaptation, and instead of the expected violent confrontation, had asked for additional reading recommendations. It's like you're running a daycare for galactic killing machines, David observed. Elena laughed, which was a sound like wind chimes made of happiness. They're not killing machines. They're just people who've been told their whole lives that being dangerous is the most important thing about them. And you don't think it is? I think being dangerous is just one thing about them. They're also curious, intelligent, creative beings who want to understand the world around them. They just need someone to give them the tools to do it. David watched Vkr'lak carefully highlight a passage in his research notes, his massive claws moving with surprising delicacy, and had to admit Elena might have a point. Chapter 6, The Methodology. David's understanding of Elena's approach got significantly more complicated when he found himself drafted as her unofficial research assistant. It happened during his 4th week at the academy, when Elena cornered him in the corridor outside his advanced military theory class and said, "I need a favor." "What kind of favor?" David asked, which was probably the wrong question to ask someone who had apparently figured out how to turn apex predators into study group participants. "I need someone to observe my sessions and take notes, from an outside perspective." "Why?" "Because I think I'm onto something, but I need to document it properly if I want anyone to take it seriously." David looked around the corridor, which was currently occupied by the usual mix of beings that looked like they could bench press a small spacecraft and beings that looked like they could hack your nervous system from 3 rooms away. "What exactly do you think you're onto?" Elena's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that David recognized from graduate students who had stumbled across something they thought might be important. "I think I figured out how to reprogram aggressive behavioral patterns through structured intellectual engagement," she said, as if this was a perfectly normal sentence. "Come again?" "Look," Elena said, pulling out her tablet and calling up what looked like behavioral analysis charts. "Most of these species have evolved complex social hierarchies based on dominance displays and territorial behavior. But underneath that, they're still social beings who crave intellectual stimulation and structured challenges." She gestured toward a group of Saurian cadets who were engaged in what looked like an animated discussion about orbital mechanics. "The problem is that their cultures have channeled all of that intellectual energy into combat and territorial disputes. But if you give them alternative frameworks for competition and achievement, they adapt remarkably quickly." "So you're saying that apex predators are just really competitive graduate students?" "I'm saying that competition and aggression aren't the same thing. You can be highly competitive without being destructive, as long as you have appropriate outlets for that competitive drive." David considered this. "And your study groups are those outlets?" "My study groups are laboratories for testing non-aggressive forms of intellectual competition, peer review instead of combat, academic achievement instead of territorial conquest, collaborative problem-solving instead of individual dominance displays." Elena pulled up another chart that showed behavioral modifications over time. The data was impressive. "Look at Vkr'lak's aggression metrics from the past 3 weeks, she said. "His scores on the Academy's behavioral assessment tests have dropped by 40%, while his academic performance has improved by 60%. So he's less likely to eat someone, but more likely to ace his exams?" "Exactly. And the same pattern holds across all the subjects I've been working with." David studied the data, trying to process what he was seeing. "This is revolutionary?" Elena suggested hopefully. "Terrifying," David finished. "You're basically proving that you can domesticate any species through the strategic application of homework." Elena grinned. "When you put it like that, it does sound kind of sinister, doesn't it?" Chapter 7. The Formal Experiment. What started as informal study groups evolved into something more structured when Elena managed to convince the Academy's administration to let her run an official pilot program. "The Cognitive Behavioral Modification through Academic Engagement Initiative," she explained to David as they set up observation equipment in one of the Academy's smaller lecture halls. Or, as I like to call it, Operation Homework. David helped her arrange chairs in a circle, trying not to think about the fact that those chairs were about to be occupied by some of the galaxy's most dangerous beings. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" he asked for the third time that morning. "Absolutely not," Elena replied cheerfully. "But that's what makes it interesting." The participants began arriving at 1400 hours exactly. HFY was first, carrying a tablet loaded with what looked like enough research notes to publish a small textbook. Gorthk followed, accompanied by 2 other Saurian cadets who apparently wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Sithara materialized, literally, given her species' relationship with solid matter, near the back of the room, her crystalline structure chiming softly with what David had learned was curiosity. Thorn arrived last, moving with the kind of casual grace that suggested he could kill everyone in the room without breaking stride, then taking a seat and pulling out a notebook like he was attending a perfectly normal college seminar. "Okay," Elena said once everyone had settled. "Today we're going to discuss the intersection of evolutionary biology and cultural development, using HFY's research as our starting point." What followed was unlike anything David had ever witnessed. Elena guided the discussion with the skill of someone who had spent years dealing with overconfident graduate students, keeping the conversation focused while allowing each participant to contribute their own perspective. When Gorthk made a point about territorial behavior patterns, she asked follow-up questions that made him think more deeply about his assumptions. When Sithara offered insights from her species' experience with hive mind dynamics, Elena found ways to connect that to the broader discussion. Most remarkably, when tensions began to rise, which they did, because putting apex predators in a room together was never going to be completely peaceful, Elena diffused them not through dominance displays or authority, but through redirection. "That's an interesting point of disagreement," she would say when voices started to raise. "Let's look at the data and see what the evidence supports." And somehow, impossibly, it worked. David watched beings who would normally settle disputes through combat instead engage in heated but civil academic debate. They argued about methodology, they challenged each other's conclusions, they demanded better evidence for controversial claims. But they didn't try to kill each other. "How is this possible?" David whispered to Elena during a brief break. "Because," she whispered back, "they're getting all the same competitive satisfaction they'd get from fighting, but through intellectual achievement instead of physical dominance." David looked around the room, where apex predators were forming small groups to discuss research methodologies and citation practices. "You've weaponized peer review," he said. "I prefer to think of it as applied educational psychology," Elena replied. "But yes, essentially." Chapter 8. Unexpected Complications. The success of Elena's pilot program created what military strategists would later classify as an unforeseen consequences cascade. It started when word of the study groups reached the Academy's senior faculty, who were initially skeptical but became increasingly intrigued as they reviewed Elena's preliminary data. "Cadet Rivera," said Professor Condor, the Academy's head of xenopsychology, "what you've documented here challenges some fundamental assumptions about interspecies behavioral patterns." Elena sat in the professor's office, which looked like someone had crossed a library with a museum of things that could kill you, trying not to fidget while one of the galaxy's premier experts on alien psychology reviewed her work. "The standard model suggests that apex predator species require hierarchical dominance structures to maintain social cohesion," Professor Condor continued. "Your data suggests they can adapt to collaborative academic frameworks with minimal behavioral disruption." "That's what I've observed, yes, sir," Elena replied. "The implications are significant." Professor Condor's multiple eyes focused on Elena with uncomfortable intensity. "If your methods can be scaled up and applied more broadly, it could represent a fundamental shift in how we approach interspecies conflict resolution." Elena felt her stomach do something complicated. "Scaled up how?" "The Academy has been tasked with developing new approaches to diplomatic and military challenges. Your work suggests possibilities we hadn't previously considered." Before Elena could ask what that meant, Professor Condor's communicator chimed with what sounded like a priority signal. "We'll continue this discussion later," he said. "In the meantime, I want you to prepare a formal presentation of your findings. You'll be presenting to the Academy's senior staff next week." Elena left the professor's office with the distinct feeling that her quiet little research project was about to become significantly more complicated. She was right. Chapter 9. The Presentation. The Academy's main conference room was designed to accommodate beings from across the galaxy, which meant it looked like someone had crossed a United Nations assembly with a zoo for species that evolution had gotten a little too creative with. Elena stood at the front of the room, looking out at an audience that included Admiral Vkr'lak, the Academy's commandant, Professor Condor, Colonel Vkr'lak from the Combat Instruction Department, and about 20 other beings whose uniforms suggested they had jobs with words like strategic and intelligence in the titles. David sat in the back, officially there as Elena's research assistant, but really there for moral support, and because he was fascinated to see how his accidental friend was going to explain the domestication of apex predators to the galaxy's senior military leadership. Distinguished faculty, Elena began. Over the past 2 months, I've been conducting research into alternative approaches to behavioral modification, among what we classify as apex predator species. She activated the holographic display, which showed behavioral analysis charts that looked impressive even to David, who didn't understand half of what they measured. Traditional approaches to managing aggressive species have relied on containment, deterrence, or direct confrontation. My research suggests there may be more effective alternatives. Admiral Vkr'lak leaned forward, several of her arms shifting in what David had learned was intense interest. Continue. The key insight, Elena said, is that aggression and competition aren't the same thing. Apex predator species have evolved intense competitive drives, but those drives can be redirected toward non-destructive outlets. She clicked to the next display, which showed a time-lapse analysis of behavioral changes in her study group participants. Through structured academic engagement, essentially by giving them intellectually challenging problems to solve collaboratively, we can satisfy their competitive needs while encouraging cooperative rather than aggressive behaviors. Colonel Vkr'lak made a sound that might have been skepticism. You're suggesting that homework assignments can pacify warriors? I'm suggesting that warriors are intelligent beings who need intellectual challenges as much as they need physical ones, Elena replied smoothly. When those intellectual challenges are provided in a structured, collaborative environment, aggressive behaviors decrease while academic performance improves. She clicked to a video clip from one of her study sessions, showing Vkr'lak and Gorthik engaged in animated but clearly nonviolent debate about research methodologies. As you can see, the participants are highly engaged and intellectually competitive, but their competition takes the form of academic achievement rather than physical dominance. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Admiral Vkr'lak asked the question that Elena had been dreading. What are the practical applications of this research? Elena took a deep breath. Well, theoretically, these methods could be applied to conflict resolution, diplomatic negotiations, even military training programs. Any situation where you need to modify aggressive behavioral patterns while maintaining competitive engagement. You're talking about psychological warfare, Colonel Vkr'lak said bluntly. I'm talking about educational psychology, Elena replied. The goal isn't to control or manipulate anyone. It's to provide alternative frameworks for expressing natural competitive drives. Admiral Vkr'lak's expression was unreadable. Demonstrate. I'm sorry? I want to see a live demonstration of your methods. Can you arrange that? Elena looked out at the assembled faculty, all of whom were watching her with the kind of interest that suggested her answer was going to have significant consequences. Yes, she said. I can arrange that. Chapter 10. The Live Demonstration. 3 days later, Elena found herself in the Academy's largest lecture hall, facing an audience that included not just the Academy faculty, but also representatives from several major galactic governments, who had apparently heard about her research and wanted to see it in action. No pressure, David said as they finished setting up the presentation equipment. None whatsoever, Elena replied, her voice only slightly tight with what might have been mild panic. The demonstration subjects were her usual study group participants, plus several additional volunteers who had asked to participate after hearing about the program. This meant that Elena was about to attempt group academic facilitation with 12 apex predators from 8 different species, while being watched by some of the galaxy's most influential military and political leaders. The scenario is straightforward, she announced to the room. We have a complex xenobiological question that requires collaborative analysis and synthesis of data from multiple cultural perspectives. She activated the holographic display, which showed what looked like a 3-dimensional puzzle made of biological and cultural data. The question is, how do different species' evolutionary histories influence their approaches to social organization? And what can we learn from those differences to improve interspecies cooperation? What followed was 90 minutes of the most productive academic discussion David had ever witnessed. Elena guided the conversation with the skill of someone who had spent months learning how to channel competitive drives into intellectual achievement. When Vkr'lak made a point about Kethmori pack hunting strategies, she asked questions that helped him connect that to broader patterns of social cooperation. When the Saurian participants offered insights about territorial organization, she found ways to link that to the crystalline being's approach to collective decision-making. Most remarkably, when disagreements arose, which they did, because academic disagreement was still disagreement, Elena turned them into opportunities for deeper analysis rather than sources of conflict. "That's an interesting contrast in perspectives," she would say when voices began to rise. "Let's examine the underlying assumptions and see what the evidence tells us." By the end of the session, the participants had not only solved the original problem, but had also generated what looked like the foundation for a comparative study of interspecies social organization. The audience reaction was immediate and dramatic. "Extraordinary," Admiral Vkr'lak said during the post-demonstration debrief. "You've essentially created a method for turning potential conflicts into collaborative problem-solving opportunities. The applications for diplomatic negotiations alone could be revolutionary," added Ambassador Korthval from the Galactic Council. "If these methods can be adapted to larger-scale interactions..." Elena felt her throat go dry. "Larger scale how?" "Intergovernmental negotiations, trade disputes, territorial conflicts." Ambassador Korthval's multiple eyes focused on Elena with uncomfortable intensity. "Situations where traditional diplomacy has failed because the parties involved are too focused on competitive dominance to engage in productive dialogue." I'm not sure my methods would scale up to that level," Elena said carefully. "Perhaps not yet," Admiral Vkr'lak replied. "But that's what pilot programs are for." David watched Elena's expression and recognized the look of someone who had just realized their quiet research project was about to become something much larger and more complicated than they had ever intended. Chapter 11. Scaling Up. 2 weeks later, Elena found herself aboard a diplomatic vessel heading for the Kepler colonies, where a territorial dispute between 3 different species had been festering for the better part of 5 years. "This is insane," she said to David, who had somehow gotten himself assigned as her research assistant for what the Academy was calling a field application study. "Yeah," David agreed, looking out the viewport at the 3 separate military fleets that were currently maintaining what could generously be called a tense standoff around the disputed system. "But it's the interesting kind of insane." The situation was exactly the sort of thing that Elena's research suggested might be amenable to her methods. 3 species, the Valdari, the Senth, and the Creel, had competing claims to a system that contained valuable mining resources. Each species had valid historical arguments for their claim. Each was convinced the others were acting in bad faith, and each was prepared to go to war rather than back down. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed because none of the parties trusted the others enough to engage in meaningful negotiation. Military solutions were problematic because all 3 species were allied with major galactic powers, which meant that any conflict could potentially escalate into something much larger. "So naturally," Elena said, reviewing the briefing materials for the 20th time, "they decided to send a graduate student with a handful of study group techniques." "A graduate student who has successfully domesticated some of the galaxy's most dangerous apex predators through the strategic application of homework," David pointed out. "That's different." That was controlled, small scale, with participants who had voluntarily signed up for academic study groups. "And this is?" Elena gestured toward the viewport, where the rival fleets were maintaining their careful positions like pieces on a 3-dimensional chessboard. "This is 3 governments who hate each other, have been preparing for war for 5 years, and are now being asked to sit down and work out their differences through collaborative academic analysis." "When you put it like that," David said, "it does sound kind of unlikely to succeed." The diplomatic vessel docked at Haven Station, a neutral facility that had been established specifically to host the negotiations. Elena and David were met by Ambassador Yorthuk, a veteran diplomat who looked like he had been personally involved in every major galactic crisis of the past century. "Dr. Rivera," he said, "I hope you understand the significance of what we're attempting here." "I'm beginning to," Elena replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "The Kepler colony's situation has been intractable for years. 3 species, each with legitimate claims, each convinced that compromise means surrender. Traditional diplomacy has failed because none of them trust the others enough to negotiate in good faith." Ambassador Yorthuk led them through the station's corridors, which were designed with the kind of neutral aesthetic that suggested someone had worked very hard to avoid offending anyone. Your research suggests that we might be able to reframe the conflict as a collaborative problem-solving exercise, rather than a zero-sum competition. That's the theory, Elena said. Whether it works in practice with actual governments instead of individual study group participants, that's what we're here to find out. Chapter 12, The Impossible Negotiation. The first challenge was getting all three parties to agree to participate in what Elena was calling a collaborative analysis framework. The Valdari delegation was led by Minister Corthan, a being who looked like someone had crossed a diplomat with a small tank and given the result an advanced degree in interstellar law. The Senth were represented by Counselor HFY, no relation to the huntmaster Elena had worked with at the academy, who had the kind of crystalline beauty that made you forget they could probably kill you with their mind. The Creel delegation was headed by war leader Threnk, whose title alone suggested that negotiations might be challenging. "This is unprecedented," Minister Corthan said when Elena explained her proposed approach. "You're asking us to treat a territorial dispute as if it were an academic exercise." "I'm asking you to examine the underlying issues collaboratively instead of competitively," Elena replied. "Instead of each side trying to prove the others wrong, we work together to understand the full complexity of the situation." War leader Threnk made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could level buildings. "You want us to do homework with our enemies?" "I want you to do research with your neighbors," Elena corrected. "The goal isn't to determine who's right and who's wrong. The goal is to understand what everyone actually needs and find solutions that address those needs." Counselor HFY's crystalline structure chimed with what Elena had learned to recognize as skepticism. "And you believe this approach will succeed where traditional diplomacy has failed?" "I believe it's worth trying," Elena said. "What we've been doing hasn't worked. Maybe it's time to try something different." The first session was, David later noted in his observation log, a diplomatic disaster of epic proportions. All three delegations arrived with prepared positions, extensive legal briefs, and what appeared to be genuine hostility toward each other. Elena's attempt to begin with collaborative problem identification immediately devolved into accusations, counter-accusations, and at least one threat of violence. "This is not working," Elena said to David during a break after the first hour. "It's exactly like your first study group session," David pointed out. "Remember? HFY nearly ate someone before you figured out how to channel his competitive instincts. That was one individual. This is 3 entire governments. Same principle, larger scale." Elena looked back at the conference room, where the 3 delegations were maintaining their separate positions with the kind of rigid formality that suggested everyone was one wrong word away from walking out. "I need to change the framework," she said finally. Chapter 13. Reframing the problem. Elena's breakthrough came when she stopped trying to get the 3 sides to work together, and instead got them to compete with each other in a completely different way. "Here's what we're going to do," she announced when the session resumed. "Instead of debating who has the best claim to the Kepler system, we're going to have a competition." War leader Threnk leaned forward. "What kind of competition?" "A research competition. Each delegation gets to present the most comprehensive, well-documented, academically rigorous analysis of the Kepler situation. Not just your own claims, but the entire historical, legal, and economic context." Elena activated the holographic display, which showed what looked like a complex analytical framework. "You'll be judged on the quality of your research, the thoroughness of your analysis, and most importantly, your ability to accurately represent not just your own position, but the positions of the other parties." Minister Corthan's eyes narrowed. "You want us to argue our enemies' cases?" "I want you to demonstrate that you understand the full complexity of the situation, that you've done your homework well enough to present everyone's perspective accurately and fairly." "And the winner?" Counselor HFY asked. "The winner gets to present their recommended solution to the Galactic Council with the full backing of this negotiation process." What followed was 3 weeks of the most intensive research effort David had ever witnessed. Each delegation threw themselves into the competition with the kind of focused intensity that Elena had learned to recognize as redirected competitive drive. They researched historical precedents, analyzed economic data, consulted legal experts, and interviewed local populations. But most importantly, they had to understand and accurately represent their opponents' positions, which meant they had to actually listen to what the other sides were saying. "It's brilliant," David said to Elena during the second week, as they watched Valdari researchers working alongside Senth analysts to verify historical data. "They're competing to see who can best understand the entire situation, not just their own piece of it." "The beautiful thing," Elena replied, "is that they're doing all the work that traditional diplomacy would require, But they're doing it because they want to win the competition, not because someone's making them. By the third week, something remarkable had happened. The three delegations had stopped treating each other as enemies and started treating each other as rival research teams. They were still competitive, but their competition had shifted from who can dominate the others to who can produce the best analysis. Minister Corthon, Elena said during one of the final sessions, your delegation's analysis of synth cultural practices was particularly thorough. How did you arrive at those conclusions? We interviewed 17 different synth cultural historians, Minister Corthon replied with obvious pride. We wanted to make sure we understood their perspective accurately. And War Leader Threnk, your economic modeling of the proposed Valdari mining operations was very detailed. We spent 2 weeks reviewing their financial projections, Threnk said. We needed to understand whether their claims about economic benefits were realistic. David watched the interaction and realized what Elena had achieved. By making thorough understanding of all perspectives a competitive advantage, she had turned the negotiation process into a collaborative research project. Chapter 14. The Unexpected Solution. The final presentations took place in Haven Station's main conference hall, with observers from across the galaxy watching what had been billed as a novel approach to interstellar conflict resolution. Each delegation had prepared comprehensive analyses that were, David had to admit, more thorough and nuanced than anything that had emerged from 5 years of traditional diplomatic efforts. The Valdari presentation demonstrated detailed understanding of synth cultural values and Creel economic needs. The synth analysis showed sophisticated grasp of Valdari legal traditions and Creel military concerns. The Creel research revealed deep appreciation for Valdari historical claims and synth environmental priorities. But the real surprise came when Elena asked for final recommendations. Based on your research, she said, what solutions would you propose? Minister Corthon stood up first. Based on our analysis, we believe the optimal solution involves joint administration of the Kepler system, with resource extraction managed collaboratively, according to each species' strengths and needs. War Leader Threnk nodded. Our research reached similar conclusions. The system's resources are complex enough that they require the expertise of all 3 species to extract efficiently. And, Councillor Vkr'lak added, our cultural analysis suggests that collaborative management would actually strengthen, rather than weaken each species' long-term interests in the region. Elena looked around the room at 3 delegations who had spent 5 years preparing for war, and 3 weeks learning to understand each other's perspectives. So you're all recommending essentially the same solution? The research supports collaborative management, Minister Corthon said. It's the most logical conclusion based on the available data. David watched the faces of the various observers and saw expressions ranging from amazement to something approaching awe. Elena had done it. She'd turned a territorial dispute into a collaborative research project, and in the process, the 3 parties had talked themselves into a solution that none of them could have reached through traditional negotiation. Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of various classifications, Elena said formally, I believe we have reached a consensus. The Kepler Accords, as the agreement came to be known, established the first tri-species joint administration in galactic history. More importantly, they established Elena Rivera as the galaxy's first specialist in what came to be called competitive collaboration. Chapter 15. The Bigger Picture. 6 months later, Elena found herself back at the Galactic Military Academy, but this time as an instructor rather than a student. The Academy had created an entire new department around her research, the Institute for Collaborative Conflict Resolution. Elena was its director. David had somehow become her deputy, and they were tasked with training a new generation of diplomats, negotiators, and military officers in what the Academy was calling alternative engagement methodologies. I still can't believe this worked, Elena said, as they prepared for their first official class. The lecture hall was filled with cadets from across the galaxy, all eager to learn about the human who had apparently figured out how to turn enemies into study groups. I can, David replied. You've been doing this since we met. You just finally found a situation big enough for people to notice. Elena looked out at the assembled students. Vorthax, Saurians, crystalline beings, voidwalkers, and dozens of species David still couldn't identify. The thing is, she said, I don't think what I'm teaching is actually new. I think it's just something that most species have forgotten in favor of more direct approaches to problem solving. Such as? Competition doesn't have to be destructive. Intelligence doesn't have to be used for domination. Most beings, regardless of species, want to understand things, to learn, to grow. They just need frameworks that let them do that constructively instead of destructively. The first official class of the Institute for Collaborative Conflict Resolution began with Elena asking the same question she'd asked in her first Academy study group. What's the most interesting problem you've encountered recently? And what would you need to solve it effectively? What followed was 2 hours of the most productive academic discussion David had witnessed since Elena's original sessions with HFY and the others. Beings who would normally settle disagreements through combat instead engaged in passionate but civil debate about research methodologies, analytical frameworks, and evidence standards. They argued about conclusions, they challenged each other's assumptions, they demanded better support for controversial claims. But they didn't try to kill each other. You know, David said to Elena after the students had left, you've essentially weaponized the Socratic method. I prefer to think of it as applied educational psychology, Elena replied. But yes, essentially. David looked around the empty lecture hall, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. A small human woman who had figured out that the best way to handle apex predators was to give them homework. A territorial dispute that had been resolved through competitive research. A new approach to conflict that treated enemies as potential study partners. What's next? He asked. Elena smiled, and David recognized the expression from their first meeting in the Academy library. It was the look of someone who had just realized there were much bigger problems to solve. The Galactic Council has asked us to look at the Outer Rim conflicts, she said. Apparently there are 17 different species who have been fighting over trade routes for the past decade. And you think your methods will work on that scale? I think, Elena said, that most conflicts are really just poorly organized research projects. People fighting over resources they don't fully understand, making decisions based on incomplete information, refusing to consider perspectives they haven't taken time to study properly. David considered this. So your solution is to make them do their homework? My solution is to make doing their homework more rewarding than fighting about it. Elena gathered her materials and headed toward the exit, already planning what would become the largest-scale application of collaborative conflict resolution in galactic history. David followed, thinking about apex predators who had learned to prefer peer review to combat, about territorial disputes that had been resolved through competitive research, and about a small human woman who had apparently figured out how to domesticate an entire galaxy through the strategic application of good study habits. It was, he had to admit, a much better outcome than anyone had expected when humanity first joined the galactic community. Epilogue. The Human Factor. 2 years later, the Galactic Council established the Rivera Institute as an independent organization dedicated to collaborative conflict resolution. Elena's methods had been successfully applied to trade disputes, territorial conflicts, and at least 3 situations that the diplomatic corps had previously classified as impossible. David, now the Institute's director of field operations, found himself traveling across the galaxy teaching beings how to turn their competitive instincts toward constructive, rather than destructive ends. The approach didn't work in every situation. Some conflicts really were based on irreconcilable differences or genuine malice. But it worked often enough that Rivera protocols became standard training for diplomatic and military personnel across known space. The thing about humans, Elena said during a lecture at the Institute's 2nd annual conference, is that we're not actually special because we're peaceful or because we're violent. We're special because we're really, really good at figuring out alternative ways to do things when the obvious approaches don't work. She looked out at an audience that included representatives from over 200 species, many of whom had been involved in conflicts that were now resolved through collaborative frameworks rather than military action. Every species has competitive instincts. Every species has intelligence. Every species has the capacity for both cooperation and conflict. The trick is creating structures that make cooperation more rewarding than conflict. After the lecture, David was approached by a young cadet he didn't recognize, humanoid, but clearly not human, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested she was about to ask a very serious question. Commander Sterling, she said, I've been studying Director Rivera's methods, and I have a question about practical applications. Go ahead. What do you do when competitive collaboration isn't enough? When beings really do want to hurt each other rather than understand each other? David considered this. It was the question that came up in every training session, the limitation that Elena's methods couldn't fully address. That's a good question, he said finally. And the honest answer is that sometimes you need traditional solutions. Sometimes people really do want to cause harm, and no amount of structured dialogue is going to change that. So these methods are just one tool among many? Exactly. The trick is knowing when to use which approach. Elena's methods work when the underlying issue is competition over resources or misunderstanding of perspectives. They don't work when the underlying issue is genuine malice or ideology that requires the suffering of others. The cadet nodded thoughtfully. So the human contribution isn't that you've eliminated conflict? The human contribution is that we've provided an alternative to conflict for situations where conflict isn't actually necessary, David replied. Turns out that covers a lot more situations than anyone expected. As David walked back to his quarters, he reflected on how much the galaxy had changed since Elena's first study group session. Beings who would have spent centuries fighting over territory now collaborated on resource management. Species that had been traditional enemies now worked together on research projects. Apex predators that had once settled disputes through combat now preferred academic conferences. It wasn't a perfect solution, nothing ever was, but it was a better solution than what they'd had before. And sometimes, David thought as he looked out at the stars, better was enough. The end.